In this lecture, we will be discussing grouping of individuals according to similarity. Now, grouping of individuals can be looked upon as a problem which arises in multivariate data. Not that it does not arise in univariate data, but grouping individuals according to similarity is much more simple in case of univariate or even for bivariate data. For example, if we look at a problem where we have to line up a class of students to take a group photograph. So we want to get 3 rows of these students, and what we do is we first arrange the students according to height, take the shorter students and put them into the first row, take the taller students and make them stand in the third row, and students of medium height are then accommodated into the second row. So we can see that we can split the students of the class into 3 groups, one who are short, one who are tall, and one who are of medium height. We do not really need to use complicated statistical tools to do this. Now let's look at a slightly more complex problem. The students consist of both boys and girls. Then how do you do this grouping? Should we bring the girls in the first few rows and the boys in the latter rows? Or should we look at the shorter students in the first row, maybe boys and girls, and the taller students in the latter rows? So if we bring the girls in the first rows and the boys at the back, it might be that a tall girl might come in front of a short boy, and that would create a problem when we take the photograph. So this problem becomes slightly more difficult. But again, this is not so difficult to handle. We may actually put the girls on the left hand side and the boys on the right hand side, and then according to height we arrange them in their rows. But just imagine if this number of characteristics, when it becomes more than 2. As the number of variables or characteristics increases, the problem becomes much more complex, and hence we need to use statistical methods to tackle this situation. Now, grouping of variables has 3 different aspects. The first of them is, given a raw group of individuals, that is ungrouped group of individuals, what we need to do is to cluster them, that is, put them into separate groups. That is referred to as the problem of cluster analysis. Once having formed these groups, we need to identify what the groups stand for and what the characteristics of these different groups are. This is done by what is referred to as discriminant analysis. A third aspect that we very often look at is the problem where a new individual comes in. The question now is which group that we should put this individual into. That is referred to as a problem of classification. The problem of grouping of individuals can be subdivided into 3 different aspects. The first of this is that when we are given a number of individuals and they say there are m characteristics of each individual, we need to find out as to how similar these individuals are to each other, and hence cluster them according to this similarity. This problem is generally referred to as cluster analysis. So the individuals, these n individuals are grouped into, say, m different clusters. Once these clusters are formed, the next problem is to identify why these clusters are different from each other. So we need to study the properties of each of these clusters according to the different characteristics. This is referred to as discriminant analysis, where we discriminate between the clusters. The final problem is when a new individual comes in, then we need to classify this individual into one of the given clusters. So we need to check as to how this individual's characteristics match with a given cluster, and the closeness of the match actually classifies the individual to a particular cluster. This is referred to as a classification problem. Now, to look at the grouping problem, so first we look at cluster analysis in this study. To do cluster analysis, we need to look at the distance between two individuals. What is meant by distance between two individuals is that we have several characteristics of these individuals. Now, two individuals may be similar with respect to one characteristic, and two different individuals may be similar with respect to another characteristic. So how do we identify which of these are closer to each other? So we need to find some way of saying that these two individuals are closer to each other than maybe a third individual. So this is the distance that we need to find out first. Let for two individuals, say R and S, we define the vector of their M characteristics by XR, which is XR1, XR2, XRM, that is the M characteristics of this rth individual, and XS, which is XS1, XS2 and XSM, which are the M characteristics of the second individuals. So how do you define the distance between this rth and the sth individual? There are various measures that we can use. The simplest of these measures is referred to the city block distance or the Manhattan distance. This is given by the summation of the absolute difference between the characteristics, each of these characteristics of the two individuals. So it's summation j equal to 1 to m modulus of xrj minus xsj. As opposed to this, the other very popular measure that is used is the Euclidean distance, which is the square root of the square of the difference between each of the characteristics of the rth and the sth individual. Now, if we try and identify what this two actually means, why is it called the city block and the Euclidean distances? The city block is something like this. If we go from one point of the city to another point, we cannot go directly by the shortest route because there will be blocks of houses and we will have to take the roads along this house. So we might first have to walk east and then turn north and then walk a little bit further east and then maybe turn south. So we will be going in straight lines. This is what is referred to as a city block distance. Whereas if a bird wants to go from one place to another place from the same places, then it will fly directly over the rooftops to the given place. That is the shortest distance from one place to the other, and this is referred to as the Euclidean distance. So when we do cluster analysis, we need to define the type of distance that we are looking at. Obviously, city block distances are longer than the Euclidean distance. Now, having defined the type of distance we will look at, we form what is referred to as a dissimilarity matrix. Now, if you look at this matrix D here, you will find that the diagonals are 0 because the diagonals are the distance between the individual and his own self. So, the first element D11 is the distance between the first individual with himself and hence is 0. The second individual, the distance D12 is the distance between the first individual and the second individual. Similarly, for the ith and the jth individual, we will have a distance Dij, which will be on the ith row and the jth column of this matrix. It's quite obvious that this matrix is going to be symmetric because the distance between D12 and the distance between the first and the second individual is the same as the distance between the second and the first individual. So we just need to have a lower triangular matrix or maybe an upper triangular matrix with the diagonal elements all equal to 0. We call this the dissimilarity matrix, and this is the basis on which we'll form the clusters. Now, once we have a cluster, we need to find the distance between these clusters. So it's a cluster may be composed of n1 individuals, another cluster may be of n2 individuals. So how do you define the distance between these two groups? There are various ways of doing this. The simplest of them is referred to as the single linkage method, which is the minimum distance between individuals in the two clusters. So it's a minimum DRS, where R belongs to the first cluster and S belongs to the second cluster. So we look at all the differences between the two groups and find out the minimum of this, and we call this the single linkage distance. As opposed to this, we have what is referred to as the complete linkage method. In this case, we look at the maximum distance between the individuals in the two groups. So again, we look at all the individuals from the first group and the individuals from the second group, look at the distances between them, and then take the maximum of this distance as a measure of the cluster distance. A third method which is used is the average linkage method. In this case, we take the average of all distances between the n1 individuals in the first group and the n2 individuals in the second group. So it's a sort of an averaging over all possible distances between the individuals in the two groups. A fourth very common measure is the centroid method. Now, by the centroid of a cluster we mean the mean of that cluster. So for the first group of individuals with n1 individuals, the centroid would be x bar, which is the average over the r individuals or n1 individuals in the first group. Once having found the centroids of the clusters, what we do is we either take the city block or the Euclidean distance between these two centroids as the distance between the two clusters. Now, having defined the clustering distance as well as the distance between individuals, we need to decide on which type of clustering we'll be using. There are primarily two major types of clustering that are used. The first of them is the hierarchical clustering, where the clusters are formed as a tree. It's very widely used in biological sciences, primarily in taxonomy. In this case, the individuals are grouped in a manner such that each individual is closest to another individual who is very similar to him and very far away from an individual who is dissimilar to him. So from this tree with several branches, what we can see is that the distance between each of the n individuals, how closely or how differently they lie from each other. Hierarchical clustering can be done in two ways. That is, the tree can be formed from the bottom to the top. It's referred to as the agglomerative. And the other one is the divisive, where we start from the top with one single cluster and then keep subdividing it into smaller and smaller clusters till we come down to clusters of one individual each. As opposed to hierarchical clustering, we have what is referred to as partitioning. In partitioning, we do not look at the individual distances. What we do is we just group the individuals according to similarity, and we are not interested in the distances between individuals within a cluster. It's more important that we form different clusters and just look at the different characteristics of these clusters. Third method, which is not so very popular, is what is referred to as overlapping, where we can have a partitioning where the partition clusters may overlap on one another. In this case, a single individual may belong to more than one cluster. But then, as you can understand, this is not so easy to look at and hence not very popular in use. When we look at hierarchical clustering, what we land up is with a figure like this, which is referred to as a dendrogram. In this figure, you can see that there are individuals. This is basically data on a certain number of years, and you can see that some of the years values are closer to each other and some of them are very different to each other. For example, 1958 and 1961 values are very close to each other, whereas 1958 and 1957 values are very far apart from each other. So the position on the tree actually gives us the closeness of two individuals. And you can see that this is branched out. When we talked about agglomerative and divisive clustering, what we meant were two different methods. In agglomerative, we started from the very bottom and then went up this tree to the very top of a single cluster. In the divisive, we started from the very top and then we come down to the bottom. So that is basically a technical difference, and this is just a method by which we form this cluster. As opposed to this dendrogram, we can use the partitioning method. In the partitioning method with the same data, what we did was, now we have 4 separate groups. We do not identify which individual within the group is closer to which other individual. We just say that 1947 value, 48, 49 and 50 value forms one group. The 1951, 52, 53 forms another group. And this group is different from the 54, 55, 56, 57 groups, etc. So we just form different clusters without going into the individual values. Now the question is, when do you use hierarchical clustering and when do you use partitioning? Hierarchical clustering is primarily used when we have distinct members, like this ears here. So, or like human beings, and we are trying to group these human beings according to some similarity. Partitioning we do when we do not have very distinct individuals. For example, we are looking at two types of cells, cancer cells and non-cancer cells, and we want to subdivide this. We want to find out how the cancer cells are different from the non-cancer cells. So what we do is we just want to separate the cells, and we are not interested in individual cells. So in that case, what we do is a partitioning method. Now let's look at an example of hierarchical clustering, and we'll do this example using the agglomerative methods. Suppose we have 5 individuals A, B, C, D and E, and we measure them over 3 variables x1, x2 and x3. These are 3 characteristics of this 5 individuals. And this is the table given for this. So A has x1 equal to 5, x2 equal to 4, x3 equal to 7. Similarly for B, C, D and E. Now first of all we need to decide on the type of distance we are going to use. In this case, suppose we use the Euclidean distance. So we find out the Euclidean distance between each of these individuals. But before that, since we are doing agglomerative clustering, we are starting from the bottom. So at the very bottom there are 5 different clusters, each cluster consisting of one individual. So CA consists of A only, CB consists of B, cluster CC has only the element C, and so on and so forth. So we have 5 clusters, and then we will see who is close to whom, and then we will merge them accordingly. So firstly, using the Euclidean distance, we get the distance matrix T. And this comes out, the distance between A and B is 6.63, the distance between B and D is, for instance, 3.74, and so on and so forth. Now if you are using the single linkage method, we will be using the minimum value between these clusters. So, but first we look at the closeness among these individuals at the first step, and we see that the smallest value here is 1.41, which is the distance between A and C. This tells us that C and A are closest to each other as compared to the others. Hence we merge these two clusters, CA and CC, to form a cluster CAC, which consists of 2 elements AC now. So instead of 5 clusters, now we have 4 clusters. One is AC, the second is B, the third is D, and the fourth is E. Again, we find the distance between each of these clusters, and now we use the single linkage method. We already know the distance between B, D and E, so we don't need to redo that. But to look at the distance between the cluster AC and B, we find minimum of DAB and DBC, which comes out to be 6.63. Similarly for the other two, and this leads us to the second distance matrix, D1. From this we find that the minimum of this is 3.32, which corresponds to D and E. So we merge the clusters C and CD to form a new cluster CDE. So we now have three clusters, AC, CB and CDE. So we need to again redo the distances between these clusters. So the distance between DE and AC turns out to be 4.24 and the distance between DE and B turns out to be 3.74. We have already calculated the distance between B and AC, which is 6.63. We put this in a table and find the minimum value to be 3.74, which corresponds to the cluster CDE and CB. So we merge these two clusters. So now we have two clusters. One cluster comprising of AC and the second cluster comprising of B, D and E. And finally we merge these two clusters which at a distance of 4.24, which is the minimum of 6.63 and 4.24, and form a final cluster. And then when we plot this, we get a dendrogram like this. Now you can see that A and C are the first two clusters which merge together at a very low level. They are the first to merge. And then after a certain height, D and E merge with each other. So they were little further away from each other than A and C are, but closer to each other than with the others. And then later B merged with D and E, and finally at the top of the tree, all the five merged together to form a single cluster. The higher the height of this dendrogram, the more dissimilar we can say that the individuals are. So the shorter the height at which they meet, the closer they are. The higher the height that they meet at, the farther apart they are. So this is primarily what is hierarchical agglomerative clustering. In this lecture, we have looked at cluster analysis, which is the problem of grouping individuals according to similarity. Now we have seen that this can be done in primarily two ways. One is the hierarchical method and the other is the partitioning method. We have also seen that to do that, we need to define some distance measures. We have introduced one or two distance measures, but then there are several other distance measures that we need to discuss in further lectures. And what we have also done today is to look at the agglomerative hierarchical technique. But then we need to expand on this as well as on the other type of hierarchical technique as well as the partitioning methods in the subsequent lectures.